Hey folks, this is Lucid, and I've got a kind of interesting little mini guide here for you. It is 10 tips to improve your gameplay as an intermediate multiplayer player in Dominions. And the goal of this is, I don't know, I've been watching some people play, and I was just thinking, like, man, some people just need like a little oomph, and they'll play a lot better. And so that's the idea of this is like, what are the main, like the high leverage points that you can take as an intermediate player and play a lot better? And there's going to be some things that obviously we're not going to talk about. Like you need to know all of like the mechanic, like most of the mechanics in the game. So, this isn't a guide about mechanics or anything like that. And also, you're going to have to invest time in thinking and scripting. And the more time you have to invest in thinking and scripting, probably the better your turns are going to be. So all the kind of mechanical stuff like that, I'm going to take for granted in this guide. And those are certainly very important to winning games. However, we're going to talk about the other things, kind of like the bigger, broader strategy. Because honestly, getting better at all the tactical scripting and stuff takes a while. You can't just like do it for your next multiplayer game. But hopefully each of these things in this list are things you can actually just go do and become better. So the first thing, and this is going to sound really obvious, but I've been watching some of the, like some casting games and whatnot, and I've just been like, oh my God, this is actually really important. And the first thing is expand well. So expansion, the first phase of the game, when you're taking over the independent provinces, the common kind of rule of thumb is in a single player game without much contesting from the AI, you need to be able to hit 20 provinces in year one. That means when you look up here at the turn timer, when you hover your mouse over the little season icon, it will say at the bottom of the screen, like here it says turn 77. When it says turn 12, stop the clock. It's spring of that year. It is, or maybe I can't remember if it says, whenever it says early spring, which is either turn 12 or 13, stop the clock. You need to have 20 provinces by then. The other kind of things that surround that are, it's not just how many provinces you have at turn 12 in a multiplayer game. It's also how quickly you get the first ones. Because a lot of times borders will start closing down in a multiplayer game around turn 8. So if you have a really slow expansion at the beginning, but maybe you catch up later, that could be difficult for you. Now, if you build up a ton of momentum, you might be able to have, a really easy kind of border contention or, semi-first war where you set some of the borders straight, but it's rough to do. So some other things to look for are, when are you getting your second expansion party out? And I would say, like, for an intermediate player, a decent guideline is by turn 4, you at least need to have 2 parties expanding. Now, if for whatever reason you've had a fair amount of attrition in your game, you're not going to be able to do that. Please do not take one party, split it into 2, and have both die. However, when you're doing your testing, that's a pretty good goal to hit. And it's a pretty good idea to try to have 3 expansion parties, if you can, by turn 6. If those slip by 1 or 2 turns, it's not a problem. But if you're needing to build up so that your second expansion party is only going out like, turn 6 or something, you have a big problem. And even if you can somehow still finagle your way into getting 20 provinces by the end of the first year, you'll get them so slowly that it's going to be very hard to have a decent border in a multiplayer game. And the other thing is, you want to probably test this at a minimum of 3 times for a multiplayer game. And the reason, there's a fewfold. You can do it, first of all, very quickly. To get to turn 12, if you're not sitting here talking to the camera like I do sometimes, it should really only take you about 20 or 30 minutes to do a test, to get all the way to turn 12. So doing it 3 times is just the smallest investment for a multiplayer game. And it's going to really pay dividends. So do it at least 3 times. It's going to give you a better feel for like all the little indie matchups and some little quirks, like what maybe your particular troop type struggles with. It'll let you kind of refine some of your scripting for when you see there's problems. And it's going to give you a good intuitive sense for when things will work and when things won't. And that's probably the most important part of the testing. The other thing just to mention in expansion testing is when you're finagling you also need to do the expansion testing just to figure out what scales to have. And your scales are usually aimed around maximizing production in the first year, which will usually tend to also, let you produce stuff in other forts in year 2 and 3. But a lot of times it's all about getting as much power out of your first fort, out of your capital, as you can in the first year. So, if you're running out of resources or you're running out of recruitment points at different times, you'll shift your scales around to make up for that. Okay, so that's the first one, expand well. The second point, and I know that's obvious, but I think a lot of people either don't expansion test enough or have too low of a bar for what good expansion testing is, or what is a good expansion. And this is totally something that's not very complicated and you can do before any multiplayer game. All right, number 2, save hard wars for later, mostly. One thing I think you will notice is good players typically do not pick a very hard first war early. But there's a little bit of a cost benefit. And we'll explain the cost benefit in a second. But the reason you don't is because, let's imagine you pick a very hard first war and somebody else picks a very easy first war. Well, there's 2 things that can happen. The other person who picks the easy first war is done with their war in 5 turns. 10 turns, right, at a max. You are involved in just a slugfest that's going to last 15 or 20 turns. Well, not only is that going to be way more expensive for you, you're going to build up less troops and spend less mages and have fewer people researching. But that's all a very significant cost, and that will also delay the amount of time from which you actually get to use this land that you're trying to bring into your empire. But in addition, the guy who had the quick first war is going to be ready to turn around and knife you at turn 10 while you're still just gridlocked in this war with this other player. So long, difficult wars, sometimes you need to take them, but ideally you save those for later, right? And that's one of the things you'll notice in the tournament finals. Anybody who showed any signs of weakness got trounced early. Oh, we lost a big army, or, oh, we failed expansion. They got absolutely trounced. And, I was a little shocked to see how adept people were at sensing that. But, it was crazy. The third point is in line of this. The third point is get out of bad wars. Or try to. Sometimes you can't. But a lot of times, a bad war is painful for both sides. And there's usually, if you think of it as a spectrum, there's a Venn diagram, right? There's this area of maybe what people would want, but the other person wouldn't accept. So I would like to get tons of land and them to give it up and make no concessions, right? And they would like to keep all of their land and not give anything up. And but that's not okay with me, and what I want is not okay with them. But then there's this middle ground where we're both giving up different things, and that middle ground is where it will probably work. A lot of times, there are plenty of deals that can be made in the middle ground if there is a bad war. Some people are going to have to give up things, and you may dig your heels in more or less, depending on the kind of terms you can get. But you have to be really careful about digging in your heels too hard. And I've definitely done this before, where somebody offered me terms for peace that I didn't like and didn't want. And I dug my heels in, and they dug their heels in. Now, they ended up getting kicked out of the game, in the particular instance I'm thinking of. They died. But I ended up, I should have taken his deal. It was a very painful thing for me to keep fighting them. It was, in retrospect, a fair deal, and I should have taken it. So get out of bad wars. And that's one of the things the players that I think are better than me typically do better than me, is they get out of bad wars very effectively. And oftentimes that will mean accepting some losses that will be painful to you, but they're better than the alternative of getting into a pissing contest with some other guy in a lose-lose situation. All right, the fourth thing is killer instinct. And we've talked a lot about save hard wars for later, get out of bad wars. This is the flip side of that. This is when you sense weakness you must absolutely pounce on it. And there's exceptions to this, as there's exceptions with almost everything in Dominions and in life. But the exceptions are, you don't want to necessarily get, like, let's say you're surrounded by wounded animals. Do you want to eat them all? You know, like a good example is my Machaca game, and I ate Saramatia. You know, maybe that was a good idea, but it also made me the target of everybody on the whole map killing me, like attacking me. Maybe it would have been better to let them go. So with the caveat that you want to be very careful about getting too big if you're not ready to defend all your lands against all the potential aggressors. With that caveat, when you see a wounded animal, you need to make your move. And the wounded animal can be somebody that you have a very strong matchup against, you have a big tech advantage against. It could be you just think you have a skill difference, like you've played a lot more than they have. And it could also be that they've just suffered some horrendous loss or something like that, like they were fighting some other war and whatnot. If you see a wounded animal, there's a very strong, compelling reason to go and kill it in Dominions. Now, that said, they may be a strategic ally, they may be friendly, and all these other things that you may not want to go do it. And I've definitely not engaged in wars because I'm friendly with somebody, even though I could probably kill them. Some of that is like, you don't want to be too big. But the other thing, there's definitely like the relationship thing that factors in there some. However, I would suggest if you're having trouble winning games, find, when there's somebody who's really wounded and you don't need to worry too much about getting bigger, like go in there and do a lethal blow. And I think that this is another thing too. If you watch the tournament finals, look at how Vanheim plays. I think Vanheim is in many ways like, well, Pangea too, but they just have extreme killer instincts. And like when Vanheim commits on somebody, he brings so much stuff. Like he's not fighting with you because he wants to fight. He's fighting with you to kill you. Like, it's just such a strong commitment. And that's the other part of the killer instinct, is knowing what you're going to need to bring to a fight to just obliterate somebody. And when you get that sense, like, I have the things that would let me obliterate them, and they're right there weak, ready to be obliterated, you just go and do it. And anyway, that's the killer instinct. And having that sense, it's a sense. You have to know when you're in a position where you can kill and you're not going to get dragged into one of these really bad wars, and when you sense it, you take it. So anyway, that's the killer instinct, and that's something you see really good players doing. Now, of course, a lot of that's based on intuition, and if you haven't played a ton of games, this is one of the ones that's going to be a little hard to just go implement. However, you see somebody get slammed and all their majors die, or their big army dies, and they have nothing on your border, and you're not in any other entanglements, it's probably a pretty good time to end your non-aggression pact and go attack them if it's a decent national matchup. Okay, so that's 4. 5 is know the first research targets for your nation. And again, this is like really obvious, but go read a guide, have a good idea about the first research targets for your nation. So, like Satis, a lot of times you go enchantment 5 or something. So know that. And then go look at your neighbors are. And then you have to say, okay, let's say I have this. What are their first research targets probably going to be? You think about that, and then you're like, okay, well, how will this probably play out if we fight each other? And that's a lot of times how you're going to determine whether it's a good or bad matchup. So anyway, but know that, like, I think, like, I have played Dominions a lot, and I still read guides from other people every time before I play a nation and before I make a national overview. I'll go scour all the discords and the forums for guides and just read what people say. And a lot of times I don't agree with it. A lot of times I don't agree with the guide. I almost never follow a guide exactly, but I just pick up little bits and pieces from every time I read. I'm like, oh, that's a good idea. That's an important consideration I hadn't thought of. But, that's all. There's a lot of stuff in a guide that's really complicated. I would say reading it, you really need to have a decent idea of what are the best options to hit your first 5 in and to hit your first 6 in. And then for an early war, what's your best, 3? So I would take, at least extract that much information out of guides. And that's, again, kind of obvious, but do it. Like, actually do it for the nations you're playing. The next thing, and actually I think I probably should have moved this up in the list because it's really important, is mages need to protect the armies, and armies need to protect the mages. And I know that's going to sound obvious, but I want to explain to you or tell you about a way in which it doesn't work out maybe how you want to. Like it doesn't work out where mages protect armies and armies protect mages. Let's say you're going off to fight somebody, or somebody's going to fight you, and you want to have all of your mages sitting in your lab researching like good little mages. So you take all of your troops and you put them on your commanders and you send them off to fight with maybe like 4 or 5 mages, right? And that's what they're going to go do. And they fight and the enemy kills them all, and now you have a bunch of mages sitting in labs, but you don't have an army. Well, 2 things are bad that have happened here. One is it's very likely you're not going, like when a proper army rolls on top of a fort full of mages, I mean, it's possible the mages mobilize and kill them, because some mages are really strong. Like, here we could summon a bajillion air elementals, right? And we have a shot. But, so it's possible you just straight up kill them. But it's going to be a lot harder without any troops, and you're going to suffer way more mage attrition than you would if you had like mages with a proper army. So it's very likely the mages will die to a proper army without like a good army support. And you've also basically sacrificed this army and the small amount of mages you moved in with them when you left all the other mages behind. And it's one of the things, too, where the defender in a war a lot of times has an advantage. And so I think the way to think about this, guys, is when you're on the defensive, you have the ability for much lower cost to bring a lot of mages to a fight. And especially if you're in like a 2v1, holding in raiding lands, like in keeping control of all of your lanes is important, and you want to do that, and you want to use mages to do that and whatnot. And, research is not very important. Like, the more dire your situation gets, the less important it is to have mages researching, unless there's some really, really important target that's just right on the cusp. But in general, what you want to avoid is you want to avoid having your armies die while you have your mages alive. Because that's one thing that happens all the time. So what am I saying here? It's knowing how many mages to bring with an army. And this is different on the attack and on the defense. Because on the attack, you generally don't want to take your whole mage corps and roll out for a fight. But when you're on the defensive and it's a dire situation, that's actually not usually a bad idea. And it's not a bad idea for a few reasons. One is because usually you're not going to move very far. So like you come here for a fight and then you research the next turn. You only wasted 1 mage turn for every mage you move. If I were to take all these guys, go on the offensive, like this is my single player game with Man, like here, we march this huge army with all these mages down here to kill, who's this, Arco. They've been wandering around like 30 mages for 5 turns or something. They had to sit here and siege this fort. It takes a long time. We sacrificed a ton of research. The cost is very high, right? So, if you're going to go engage in a war, you're going to need to bring enough mages to win the war. And this gets into like the killer instinct and going after the right target. Because a lot of times you don't want to engage in a war where you're going to have to mobilize your whole mage corps to win it. That would be like, and then because if they died, oh my god, you'd be out of the game. Right? But if you're defending yourself, you can mobilize a large portion of your mage corps. And that's why like picking the right target for your first war makes like so much of a difference. It matters a ton. You want to pick ideally somebody that you can win a war against without having to mobilize your whole mage corps. But you may need to mobilize some mages, and some of that is like stuff you need to figure out. The minimum you want to mobilize is enough to get all the important buffs on your troops. If you were fighting in the mid game with significant armies of like 100+ units, and you're not putting buffs on them or the important buffs that your nation can do, you're definitely bringing too few mages to a fight. However, that may not be sufficient. You may need to bring way more, and you may need to put gems on your mages. And that's kind of like a whole nother layer to this. You need mages to protect your troops, And you kind of need gems to protect your mages because there's so many spells where mages are much more powerful if they have gems on them. So that is it. And if you just remember one thing from this whole guide, remember, protect your armies with your mages. And I think that will serve you very well in games. All right, point number 7. Get mages that are strong with your research targets. Don't get distracted by cheap mages, right? Get mages who you can use in a pinch is another way to say it. Now, some little dinky guy with just some random paths, you actually can summon elementals and stuff with these, and the astral guys are useful on their own. So, like, you could drum up a case for almost any mage in the game, like, oh, they could cast Swarm or something, right? In general, though, I think especially the more new of a player you are, getting the strongest mages you can, and by that I don't necessarily mean the most number of paths, but I mean with the research you've selected to do for your first, your first 5s or your first 7, given those are your research targets, which of the mages on your roster is going to be able to do the most heavy lifting if you need to deploy them in mass? And that is probably what you want to fill out your roster with. And the reason for that is so that if you get attacked and you get forced into a progressively more desperate situation, you can defend yourself. And that's always, there's a lot of mages who can do really useful things. Like even Astral Ones, they can do tons of point buffing. They can jump in communions. So sometimes you can go, like getting a budget mage, is not a bad idea, but you need to get strong budget mages if you're going to get budget mages, right? Like you don't want to get, like there's some nations where you can focus on like divine researchers where they don't even have magic paths or something, and they just sit there and research without magic paths. Like, great, those are fine, and sometimes they can really speed up your research, but it's very risky. Because if you get attacked, you're missing one of your major defensive tools, which is mobilizing your mage core. So yeah, make sure, that's like with Man here, we got Magister Arcanes. Like, are they they're expensive. I haven't done I didn't even look, guys, at the upkeep cost versus how much research they give. I didn't even look at it. I wasn't ever like, oh, I wonder if these Magisters are more efficient per upkeep. They may or may not be. It is not even important, because we're going to have forts filled up with these Magisters, and if somebody wants to fight, good fucking luck, right? Because they're going to have to fight into like a fully immobilized mage core. So that is basically that. Make sure you get mages that are useful. The better you are at the game, you probably are still going to want to do that more. However, I will give you clearance if you're a vet to make decisions which are greedy to get really efficient researchers if you want to. But if you're not a vet, like if you're not very good at the game, don't get mages because like, oh, you want to research fast. Get mages because they're good in combat, and researching, they do that as a side thing. Like, there is a little bit more to this, which I'll mention, which is, like, let's say you're an Astral Nation, and the mages which you're going to have, which are going to be doing a lot of point buffing or whatever if you get researched, are Astral 1 mages. In that case, they're not going to research much per mage, right? In that case, you definitely would want something like magic scales to ramp that up. And you also may say, I'm going to get a more powerful, like I'm thinking of like Bandarlog or something. You may get a more powerful mage to do your researching, but they would also be useful in combat. You don't have to... Anyway, I think you guys understand the point. Main thing, get mages that are going to be useful. All right, following up from that, spend your gems. Do not, if you die and you have a ton of gems in your bank here, you've done something terribly wrong. Now, you can be saving up for globals, that's fine. But the other thing is, like, remember, globals take a long time to pay back. The more desperate your situation gets, the more you should be spending all of your gems. If you're not in a desperate situation, you have the luxury to bank some gems up to maybe contest a global, or to maybe trade and contest a global later. Or maybe you're just waiting for a particular spell to come online so you can spend a lot summoning, various critters or something like that. But in general, you want to spend your gems. Early in the game, if you can't think of anything better to spend it on, buy research items. There are some exceptions to this too. I mentioned some of them, like you're waiting for a spell or something to summon things. The other thing is some nations like that focus on elementals, so like Abyssia with fire or Kalem with air elementals. Sometimes you're going to want to keep a pretty big bank of fire and air so that you can drop a lot of elementals in a fight. A lot of these nations that are really focused on elementals can spend a lot of gems in a real hurry in an important fight. And they can make a lot of magic power, but it's all gone, right after they spend it. So there's some yin and yang to that. But in general, aside from those caveats, you want to spend your gems. And if you can't think of anything in the early game, do research items. Maybe in the mid game, if you're not really that worried about research or your research is fine, look at Siege Chaff. And if you're a Thug Nation, I don't need to tell you to build Thug items. People that pick Thug Nations want to put every slot full of Thug items. But anyway, spend your gems, guys. That's the other one. Okay, and the next thing, and this is again kind of obvious, but it's gold priority. And there's some skips I think people make in this, but I'm just going to lay out the gold priority. And this again is for intermediate players. If you really know what you're doing, you can deviate from this, of course, but basically every fort you have, you want to max out mage production always, and you never give up on that. That's the first priority, maxing out mage production. Second priority is troops. And what that means is, you make mages in your fort, and then you fill up troop production, and then you go to your next fort, and you make a mage, and you fill up troop production. And you keep doing that until you run out of money. If you have any money left over, that means you don't have enough infrastructure. And so then you spend that money upgrading infrastructure you already have, so like upgrading this fort or something. And then if I've upgraded all of my infrastructure and I still have money left over, it means I need to start new infrastructure, so I'd go start a palisade or something somewhere. There are times when you stop troop production and do only mages, because at some point you need more mages to research. You already have enough troops, and basically you have enough troops to protect your mages, and more mages are going to help you win a fight. However, I think the newer you are to the game, the more you want to be careful turning off troop production. If you're new to the game, or you've only played a couple multiplayer games, probably a good idea to just slam troop production in every fort. Maybe as the game goes on, you shift towards the more gold-efficient troops. In other words, the troops that cost more resources, but less gold. That's a good transition to make as you go into the mid-game. However, you want to really slam troops. Now, once you have really huge armies and you really honestly don't need more troops, you can turn them off and go to mages, but be very ready to turn them back on as your army suffers attrition. Anyway, that's a pretty major mistake I see people make. And one of the things that will happen, a lot of times this happens right after expansion when people are building their starting infrastructure. A good example of this is if you watch the tournament finals, you can look at how Bandar Log played. They were super greedy, right? And they had these big old eyes, and they were dreaming of all the infrastructure they wanted and all the mages they would produce. And they just turned off troop production for 6 or 7 turns everywhere to get all the infrastructure up. And if you turn off troop production, you get your infrastructure up a lot faster, and maybe you can kind of make up and catch up and start getting troops later. But it's really greedy, and I would not recommend that. It is a strategy that can work, but I would say now there's some nations too which have really, really garbage troops, and you may shut off troop production there faster. But in general, make troops out of your forts. There's some other exceptions to this, like if you're doing a huge PD dump because it's like a make or break situation, you may turn off recruitment of everything and do a PD dump. But otherwise, yeah. Okay, and the 10th point in this little mini guide is play your opponent's position. And what that means is you really have to say, okay, if I were my opponent, what would I do here? What are the moves I would make? what are the things I would script? What would my research targets be? And, you know, like, there was a game I was in, I just watched a battle where somebody was storming a fort, and it was like there were skelly spammers behind the fort. And it was kind of obvious if you thought about it. Of course, there were going to be skelly spammers behind the fort. Behind the fort walls. You have to have an answer to that. Like, you cannot storm a fort that has skelly spammers behind the walls in sufficient quantity and not have an answer. There are a lot of answers to that. You can bring like an overwhelming amount of banishment spam so that you just bust through the walls. You can have things that fly. You can have ethereal stuff that runs past the walls, like fire elementals or ethereal troops. There's a ton of different answers you can have, but you need to have an answer. But the thing is, like, if they haven't ever done that before, you haven't seen it because you haven't stormed any of their forts yet, you wouldn't know. So I think the thing is, I think anytime you're fighting a nation, the simplest thing to do is say, okay, let's pull up the national roster for this nation. Let's look at all the mages they have and what paths they get. And especially if you have intel from scouting, like we're like, okay, he's got no mages here. He's got no mages here. Anyway, if you can actually see what mages they have, like, okay, here's some mages, some Nekoros. You can be like, okay, well, if I've got a lot of these, what is the best move I could possibly make with the research I might have? And if you do that, like, you'll be like, okay, well, they've got, where's Arco? They've got these Nekoros, these guys, right? Nature 1s. It's possible by this time in the game they have Swarm. So if I were him, what I would do is I would bust out and I'd have them each loaded up with 3 nature gems, and I'd have them cast Swarm 3 times. They'll cast it once, they'll cast it twice, they'll pass out, and then hopefully they wake up and pass it one more time. Anyway, you do something like that, and you say, okay, how would we deal with that? And then you come up with a plan. But, like, moving from a situation where you're just thinking about the stuff that you're doing to also thinking about the stuff the other player's doing will be a major game upgrade for you. And the important thing is you don't assume your opponent's an idiot. Now, sometimes your opponent may be an idiot. They're not going to prepare for what you thought was the worst thing they could... Like, they're not going to do the thing that you thought was the best thing they could do. But that's fine. You've prepared for it. If anything, it's going to make you overly cautious. But this is the kind of caution that's good. You do want to be cautious about things that are reasonable. Like, it's totally reasonable this guy has Swarm, and he does have 30 Nature 1 mages. What would happen if he put 60 gems into just dumping Swarm at me? How would we deal with it? It may not even be a problem. It may be like, oh, we'd be fine. It may be like you get horrendously massacred. I have no idea. It depends. Right? But thinking through, like, this is the best play my opponent could make, and then understanding how you would react to that is, I think, super important. And that's a super important way to upgrade your game. And of course, there's like weird caveats with this in that obviously you can't guess all the tech they're going to have. Like, you don't have perfect information. You don't know all the troops. You don't know all the mages. You don't know who's magic phasing, who's normal phasing, moving into a province. There is so much you don't know. You can't do a perfect assessment of this. And that's why a lot of times knowledge is power. So, letting an enemy get on top of your fort sometimes can be the right call so that you can see what their script is and what they're bringing, because they're going to have to reveal things to attack you. And so a lot of the first parts of wars are often kind of information jousting, where you're trying to, not let the opponent see what you're trying to do until you can take a good fight off them. And they're trying to probe you and see what you're trying to do while maybe trying to take a good fight off of you. So anyway, that's probably like this one's like hard to implement in the sense that it's not like an easy quick fix, like go expansion test 3 times before a game. But it's probably the step that will make you the best is playing your opponent's position and like really getting in there, putting yourself in their head and seeing what they would do. And it's actually fun to do too, because you'll see like, oh my God, they did exactly what I thought they would. And that's kind of reaffirming to you, especially if you're playing with like a pretty good lobby. like, oh, I kind of understand how the game works. They did. We're in alignment on what the smart moves were. So, yeah. Anyway, that's the 10 tips. I don't know if it was quick. We're at 35 minutes. I'll just go over them again. So I've heard repetition is a good thing. So the first thing is expand well, test expansion in single player at least 3 times, and don't have a low bar. Make sure that you're at least getting 20 provinces year 1, and ideally you have really good timing on your expansion parties. And it's even better if you can get more. Like 25 is great. All right, second one, save hard wars for later. Mostly, sometimes you have to have a hard war when you don't want to. But there's a lot of good reasons to have hard wars late and have easy wars early. The third point is get out of bad wars, and that's going to often involve concessions, where neither side is completely fulfilled. But a lot of times it's worse than staying in a lose-lose war. Fourth is killer instinct, and this is committing adequately to obliterate an opponent when you see them wounded or weak or vulnerable. And that's an important skill to have. Taking like extreme decisive action when the time calls for it. Fifth thing is know likely first research targets, and to do that, a lot of times you're going to want to read guides. The sixth thing is protect your mages with your armies, and protect your armies with your mages. So basically, it's you want to keep enough mages in your army so that your armies don't die, because if your armies die, you're not going to have anything to protect your mages when the enemy comes a-knockin'. And the seventh point is get mages that are strong with your research targets. Don't get cheap bullshit. Get stuff that can actually do things. 8 is spend your gems. Spend your gems in combat. Spend your gems in the strategic map. Spend your gems. There are cases where it makes sense to save, but don't save by default. Save when you have special reason. 9 is gold priority. You make mages, and then you make troops, and then you upgrade infrastructure, and then you make more infrastructure. But basically, don't overbuild, right? Like, make troops and shit, especially through, like, don't turn off troop production prior to turn 20. And there's a good reason to keep it on after turn 20, but there you can use your brain. Okay, and the final thing was play your opponent's position. Right, so put yourself in their head, ask what they would do, and if you understand the game pretty well, you'll have a pretty good prediction of what they're going to do, and then you can take countermeasures of your own. So with that, I hope you guys have had a great holiday, and I wish you all a happy New Year's, and we will see you in multiplayer games in the future. Take care.